Have you ever stopped to think about what happens when a human being refuses to let his soul be crushed? When everything around him screams that he is nothing, that his life holds no value, that his dreams are forbidden, and yet something inside him burns brighter than any fire his oppressors could set. I need to tell you something. This story you're about to hear is not just another tale from history books. This is the kind of story that makes you question everything you thought you knew about strength, about resistance, about what it truly means to be free. In the cotton fields of Mississippi, in 1847, there lived a man whose name the plantation owners tried to erase from memory. A man who picked up a violin, a forbidden instrument for someone like him, and did something so unexpected, so powerful, that even the cruelest overseer in 3 counties found himself unable to speak. What happened in those next few minutes changed everyone present, and I mean everyone. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe that truth has a way of surviving even the darkest times, hit that subscribe button right now, because what I am about to reveal has never been told quite like this before. Stay with me until the end. I promise you, by the time this story is over, you will not be the same person who started watching. Some truths, once heard, cannot be unheard. Now let me take you back to a place where the air itself tasted like sorrow, where the Mississippi sun beat down without mercy, and where one man's music would become a weapon more powerful than any blade. The ruins still stand. If you drive down Old River Road in Natchez, Mississippi, past the gas stations and the fast food restaurants that have swallowed so much of that land, you will find a dirt path that leads nowhere modern maps bother to mark. Follow it for half a mile, through overgrown brush and fallen oak branches, and you will arrive at what remains of Ashwood Plantation. 3 brick columns. That is all. 3 brick columns rising from the earth like broken teeth, wrapped in kudzu vines so thick they seem to be slowly pulling the last evidence of that place back into the ground. The main house burned in 1863. The slave quarters rotted away decades before that. But those 3 columns remain, and on certain evenings when the humidity hangs so heavy you can taste it, the old people in town say you can still hear music drifting from that spot. Not happy music. Not the kind of music that makes you want to dance. Something else entirely. Something that sounds like grief wearing the clothes of a melody. Something that sounds like a question that was never answered. This is where Solomon Northup would have recognized every shadow, every smell, every unspoken terror. This is where the story of Ezekiel began and ended, though ending is perhaps the wrong word for a man whose echo refuses to fade. If you want to understand what happened on that September evening in 1847, you must first understand what Ashwood Plantation was. You must smell the sweat and blood that soaked into its soil. You must hear the sounds that filled its air from before dawn until long after dark. You must feel the weight that pressed down on every soul held captive within its boundaries. If you want to accompany more cases like this one, cases that shake the very foundations of society and reveal truths that powerful men tried to bury, subscribe to this channel so you do not miss a single investigation. Ashwood sprawled across 4,200 acres of bottomland along the Mississippi River. Cotton grew there in quantities that made its owner, Colonel Jeremiah Ashworth, one of the wealthiest men in the entire South. The main house stood 3 stories tall, white columns gleaming in the brutal sun, windows reflecting the river in the distance. Behind it, invisible from the road, lay the real Ashwood. 243 enslaved human beings arranged in rows of wooden cabins that stretched toward the horizon like a city built from suffering. The bell rang at 4 in the morning. Not a gentle bell. An iron monster that hung from a post near the overseer's quarters, its sound designed to pierce sleep like a blade. By 4:15, every soul capable of walking was expected to be standing in the yard for counting. By 4:30, they marched to the fields. By 5, the picking began. Cotton does not care about human hands. Its bowls hide sharp points that slice fingertips open, that embed splinters beneath the skin, that leave hands swollen and bleeding by midday. A skilled picker was expected to harvest 200 pounds before sunset. Fall below that number 3 times in a month, and the whip came out. The whip at Ashwood had a name. They called it gospel because Overseer Silas Whitmore said it preached the only sermon these people would understand. Gospel was 5 feet of braided leather attached to a hickory handle worn smooth by use. Whitmore kept it oiled. He kept it supple. He used it with the casual expertise of a craftsman who took pride in his work. Whitmore had come to Ashwood in 1842, recruited from a failing plantation in Alabama, where his reputation for keeping order had spread through the slaveholding community like news of a miracle cure. Colonel Ashworth paid him handsomely. Whitmore earned every penny, at least by the colonel's calculation. In 5 years, Ashwood had not experienced a single escape attempt that succeeded. Not one act of organized resistance. Not one moment of open defiance. Whitmore had created something that went beyond fear. He had created a kind of paralysis, a learned helplessness so complete that the enslaved population moved through their days like sleepwalkers, their eyes fixed on the ground, their voices never rising above a murmur. The violence was systematic. Whitmore understood that random cruelty bred chaos, and chaos bred desperation, and desperate people took risks. So he created rules, clear rules, predictable rules. Break them, and punishment followed with mechanical certainty. Follow them and you might survive another day. The cabins measured 12 feet by 12 feet. 4 people to each cabin, sometimes 5. No beds, just pallets of corn husks spread on dirt floors. 1 blanket per person, regardless of season. 1 set of clothing, replaced once per year on Christmas Day, the only holiday the colonel acknowledged. Food came twice daily. Cornmeal mush in the morning, whatever scraps remained from the main house kitchen at night. The sounds of Ashwood at night still haunt the descendants of those who survived it. The coughing that never stopped, consumption spreading through the cabins like wildfire, the crying of children too young to understand why they had been born into this nightmare. The praying, always the praying, whispered voices calling out to a God who seemed to have turned his face away from that cursed land. And beneath all of it, holding the entire structure together like mortar holds bricks, was the silence. The silence of people who had learned that speaking brought attention, and attention brought pain. The silence of people who had watched their words twisted and used against them. The silence of people who had forgotten what their own voices sounded like when raised in joy. Into this world, Ezekiel moved with the particular grace of someone who had learned to become invisible. He was 34 years old in 1847, though his body carried the marks of a man 2 decades older. His hands told the story. The left hand calloused in patterns that spoke of field work. The right hand calloused differently, in places that no cotton picker would recognize. The fingers of his right hand remained strangely supple, protected in ways he never explained, wrapped each night in strips of cloth he kept hidden beneath his pallet. Ezekiel had arrived at Ashwood 7 years earlier, purchased at auction in New Orleans along with 15 others from an estate sale in Virginia. The bill of sale listed him simply as male, approximately 27, sound in wind and limb, suitable for field work. It said nothing about what he had been before, nothing about the skills he carried in his bones, nothing about the fire that still burned behind his carefully lowered eyes. In Virginia, before the estate collapsed and the auction block claimed him, Ezekiel had been something rare and precious, a musician. His former master, a man named Morrison who fancied himself a cultured gentleman, had sent him to be trained by a German music teacher in Richmond. For 6 years, Ezekiel had studied. For 6 years, his fingers had learned to coax sounds from strings that made grown men weep. For 6 years he had been trotted out at parties and gatherings, a performing wonder, proof of his master's sophistication. Then Morrison died. The debts emerged. The auction followed. At Ashwood, Ezekiel kept his past buried. He picked cotton. He kept his head down. He answered when spoken to, and disappeared when not. He became exactly what the system demanded: a body, a tool, a unit of labor indistinguishable from hundreds of others. But certain things cannot be hidden forever. The enslaved community at Ashwood knew things about each other that their masters never suspected. They had their own networks of information, their own ways of watching and remembering. They noticed that Ezekiel's right hand moved differently when he was alone, fingers pressing against his thigh in patterns that matched no work rhythm. They noticed that he sometimes hummed under his breath, melodies unlike the work songs everyone knew. They noticed, and they kept silent, and they waited. Old Sarah was the first to approach him directly. Sarah had been at Ashwood longer than anyone. 43 years, she claimed, though no records existed to confirm it. She remembered the plantation before Colonel Ashworth inherited it, before Whitmore arrived, before hope died entirely. She was too old for field work now, relegated to the kitchens where her arthritis-gnarled hands still managed to produce food that kept the colonel satisfied. She found Ezekiel alone behind the corn crib one evening, 3 years after his arrival. His right hand was moving in the air, fingers dancing across invisible strings, his eyes closed, his face wearing an expression she had not seen on anyone at Ashwood in decades. "You play," she said. Not a question. Ezekiel's eyes snapped open. Fear flooded his face, the instinctive terror of a man whose secret had been discovered. But Sarah just smiled, her few remaining teeth glinting in the fading light. "Ain't nobody gonna hear it from me," she said. "I just wanted to see. Just wanted to know there was still something like that left in this world." After that, Ezekiel's position in the community shifted in ways invisible to white eyes. People brought him things, a piece of rosin wrapped in cloth, stolen from God knows where. A length of string that might serve some purpose. A curved piece of wood that someone had shaped, night after night, with a smuggled knife. They were building something. Piece by piece over months and years, the enslaved community of Ashwood was building something their masters would never understand. Not a weapon of wood and metal, something far more dangerous, something made of memory and defiance, and the absolute human refusal to surrender the soul, even when the body had been claimed. Leave in the comments. Never give up on truth if you believe that justice should reach all the oppressed. The instrument that emerged was rough, primitive by any standard. 4 strings made of twisted gut, stretched across a body carved from a single piece of cypress. The neck was too thick, the fingerboard uneven, the pegs prone to slipping. No concert violinist would have touched it, but in Ezekiel's hands, it was a miracle. The first time he played, really played, not just tested the strings in whispered moments of stolen privacy, was at a funeral. Old Joseph had died in the fields, his heart giving out after 40 years of labor that had begun when he was 8 years old. There was no coffin. There was no ceremony sanctioned by the masters. There was only a hole in the ground at the edge of the plantation, where the enslaved were permitted to bury their dead after working hours. 20 people gathered in the darkness. They were risking punishment simply by being there. Gatherings were forbidden, always forbidden. But some things transcended fear. Some moments demanded witness. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the grave, the crude violin pressed against his neck, the bow, horsehair stretched across a bent branch, hovering above the strings. No one had asked him to play. No one needed to. The first note rose into the night like a bird escaping a cage. What followed cannot be adequately described. The music that poured from that impossible instrument carried everything: the grief of generations, the rage that could never be spoken, the love that endured despite everything designed to destroy it. Ezekiel played songs from Africa that his grandmother had taught him, melodies that had survived the Middle Passage, rhythms that still remembered freedom. He played hymns learned in Virginia, their lyrics speaking of a promised land that had to exist because this world was too broken to be all there was. He played something new, something born in that moment, a sound that was purely Ashwood, purely this community, purely the testimony of people who would not be erased. When he finished, no one spoke. The silence that followed was not the silence of Ashwood, not the silence of fear and suppression. This was the silence of the sacred, the silence of people who had witnessed something true. Word spread, as words always do among the oppressed. Quietly, carefully, with the caution born of survival, the community began to organize moments when Ezekiel could play. Never in the open, never where white ears might hear. But in spaces carved from the darkness, the back of the corn crib at midnight, the deepest part of the woods during Sunday rest hours, the inside of cabins with lookouts posted at every approach. Each performance was an act of resistance more radical than any escape attempt, though few could have articulated why. The music said something that words could not. It said, "We are still human. We remember who we were. We imagine who we might become. They have taken everything from us except this ability to create beauty, to express sorrow, to connect with something larger than our chains." The summer of 1847 arrived carrying a particular kind of heat, the kind that pressed down like a physical weight, that made the air shimmer and dance, that drove even the colonel indoors to sip cold drinks while his enslaved workers collapsed in the fields. Whitmore grew meaner in the heat. His temper, always short, became volcanic. The whip came out more frequently. The punishments grew more savage. In June alone, he had beaten 4 men bloody, sold 2 women away from their children as punishment for insolence, and shot a boy of 13 who he claimed was running for the river. The boy's name was Thomas. He was not running anywhere. He had bent down to pick up a water dipper that had fallen from his hand. But Whitmore said he saw an escape attempt, and Whitmore's word was law, and Thomas died in the dirt with his mother's screams cutting through the heat like something from a nightmare. Thomas had been Ezekiel's friend, more than friend. Ezekiel had been teaching him to play, showing him how to shape the sounds, passing on the gift that had been given to him. Thomas had talent. Thomas had promise. Thomas had a future that Whitmore's bullet erased in a single instant. That night, Ezekiel did not play. He sat in his cabin with the violin in his hands, staring at nothing, his fingers still for the first time in years. Something was shifting inside him, some internal architecture rearranging itself around a core of grief that threatened to consume everything. The others watched and worried. They had seen this before. The breaking point, the moment when a person either surrendered entirely or did something desperate. They prayed it would not come to desperation. They needed Ezekiel. They needed what his music gave them. But something else was coming. Something none of them could have predicted. Colonel Ashworth's sister-in-law, Mary Ann Beaumont, arrived at Ashwood in late August for an extended visit. She was recently widowed, childless, wealthy in her own right, and possessed of what the colonel called unfortunate notions about the treatment of the enslaved. She was not an abolitionist, not quite, but she had read certain books, attended certain lectures in New Orleans, and developed opinions that made her brother-in-law uncomfortable. Mary Ann Beaumont was also a devoted patron of music. Her late husband had supported the opera in New Orleans, had funded the training of musicians, had built a small concert hall on his plantation that still stood unused since his death. Music was her passion, her religion, the one thing that made life without her husband bearable. Within a week of her arrival, she had heard the rumors that white ears were never supposed to hear. "Jeremiah," she said at dinner one evening, her voice carrying the particular tone of a woman accustomed to being denied nothing. "I understand you have a fiddler among your people." The colonel nearly choked on his wine. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. Don't play coy with me. The servants talk, even when they think they don't. There's a man named Ezekiel who plays the violin. I want to hear him." "Mary Ann, that's impossible. Even if such a person existed, which I neither confirm nor deny, it would be entirely inappropriate." Inappropriate. Her laugh was sharp. "I've just buried my husband of 27 years. I am beyond caring about appropriate. I want to hear music. Real music. I understand this man is exceptional." The colonel stammered objections. Whitmore, present at the dinner, spoke of discipline and control and the dangers of elevating any slave above his station. But Mary Ann Beaumont had money the colonel needed, connections he coveted, and a will that neither man could match. "The harvest celebration," she finally declared. "In 3 weeks. You're planning your little party for the neighbors, yes? I want the man to play. Consider it my condition for the investment we discussed." And just like that, Ezekiel's hidden gift was dragged into the light. The news reached the quarters the next morning, delivered by a house servant whose face was tight with fear. "Master say bring the violin man to the main house. Master say he gonna play for white folk at the harvest." Ezekiel received the news with the stillness of deep water. His face showed nothing. His hands did not tremble, but those who knew him saw the shift in his eyes. Something closing off, something else opening up. He had 3 weeks. The preparation that followed was unlike anything Ashwood had seen. During the day, Ezekiel continued his work in the fields, picking cotton with the same mechanical efficiency he had displayed for 7 years. But at night, in stolen hours when sleep was the only luxury available, he practiced. Not the music he had played at funerals and secret gatherings, something different. Something he had not touched since Virginia, since the days when he performed for white audiences who saw him as a novelty, an educated animal, a trick their hosts had taught to perform. He practiced the music of their world, Mozart, Handel, Bach, pieces he had memorized years ago, pieces that lived in his fingers like ghosts. He practiced until his hands cramped, until his neck ached from holding the instrument, until the crude violin sang with sounds that seemed impossible given its construction. Old Sarah watched him one night, her ancient eyes reflecting the single candle that provided light. "What you planning?" she asked. Ezekiel did not answer immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "They killed Thomas. They killed a lot of folk. They gonna kill a lot more. I know." His bow traced a passage from a concerto, the notes falling like tears. "But Thomas was mine. Thomas was the future. They don't get to just erase that and walk away like nothing happened. What you gonna do? Can't fight them. Can't run. What's left?" Ezekiel turned to look at her, and Sarah saw something in his face that made her breath catch. Not rage, not despair, something else entirely, something that looked almost like peace. "I'm going to make them feel it," he said, "just once. I'm going to make them feel what they've done." The night of September 18, 1847, arrived carrying the first hints of autumn cool. The harvest had been exceptional, the largest in Ashwood's history, and Colonel Ashworth intended to celebrate in style. 40 guests would attend, the cream of Natchez society, planters and lawyers and politicians who controlled the fate of thousands. The main house blazed with light. Candles filled every window, every chandelier, casting a golden glow that could be seen for miles. The finest silver had been polished, the best wines had been uncorked, the smells of roasting meat and fresh bread drifted through the air like promises. In the quarters, a different preparation was underway. Ezekiel had been summoned to the house that afternoon for presentation. Whitmore's word, delivered with a sneer that made clear exactly what he thought of the entire affair. The overseer had wanted to refuse the performance entirely, had argued against it until Mary Ann Beaumont threatened to tell every social contact in 3 states about the colonel's primitive operation. Now Whitmore stood in the back of the great parlor, arms crossed, face twisted with contempt. He had made his feelings clear to Ezekiel that morning. "You play your little songs, boy, and then you get back to the fields. Don't think this changes anything. Don't think this makes you special. You're still property. You're still mine." Ezekiel had nodded. "Yes, sir." But his eyes, meeting Whitmore's for just a moment, held something the overseer could not identify. Something that made him uncomfortable in ways he could not articulate. The guests arrived in carriages that lined the circular drive. Women in silk and lace, men in evening coats, laughter and chatter, and the casual cruelty of people who had never questioned whether their comfort was built on suffering. Mary Ann Beaumont held court in the parlor, accepting condolences for her husband's death, deflecting questions about her future plans. She had positioned herself near the fireplace, directly in front of the small platform that had been constructed for the performance. Whatever happened tonight, she intended to witness every moment. Dinner stretched for 2 hours, 8 courses, each more elaborate than the last. Toasts to the colonel's success, to the South's prosperity, to the continuation of our way of life. Wine flowed freely, voices grew louder. By the time the last plate was cleared, the guests had achieved the particular state of warm satisfaction that precedes entertainment. "And now," the colonel announced, his voice carrying the slightly slurred confidence of significant alcohol consumption, "a special treat. My sister-in-law has requested a musical demonstration. We have among our people a fellow who has received some training on the violin. I present him for your amusement." Ezekiel entered from the back of the room. He was dressed in clothes borrowed from the house servants. Clean cotton shirt, wool trousers, bare feet polished until they shone. In his hands he carried the crude violin, its rough construction drawing titters from several guests. "Good Lord," one woman whispered, loud enough to be heard. "Is that what he's going to play?" Her husband snorted. "What did you expect? A Stradivarius?" Whitmore laughed from his position near the door. It was a particular kind of laugh, designed to establish dominance, to remind everyone present of the natural order. Several guests joined in. Ezekiel stood motionless on the small platform, eyes lowered, face revealing nothing. He waited until the laughter subsided. He waited until the room grew quiet with expectation. He waited until he could feel every eye upon him, measuring, judging, preparing to be either amused or disappointed. Then he raised his violin. The first note silenced everything. It was impossible. That was the thought that crossed every mind in that room simultaneously. The sound emerging from that crude instrument was simply impossible. Clear as crystal, pure as light. Rich with overtones that seemed to fill not just the ears but the chest, the throat, the very bones. Ezekiel began with Mozart, the Adagio from the Violin Concerto No. 3, a piece that demands technical perfection and emotional depth in equal measure. His fingers moved across the strings with a precision that made several guests gasp audibly. His bow drew sounds that should not have been possible, sounds that the German masters in Europe struggled to produce. The first minute passed in stunned silence. The second minute brought tears to Marianne Beaumont's eyes. The third minute saw several guests gripping their chairs as if afraid they might float away. Whitmore's laughter had died in his throat. The Mozart transitioned seamlessly into something else, a piece that no one in that room recognized, because it had never existed before. It was born there in that moment, improvised from the depths of a soul that had witnessed horrors none of the assembled guests could imagine. The music spoke, not in words, but in something deeper. It spoke of chains and whips and children torn from mothers' arms. It spoke of backs scarred by leather, of spirits bent but not broken, of prayers sent up from dark cabins to a heaven that seemed impossibly far away. It spoke of Thomas, of his young face, of the light dying in his eyes as he fell. It spoke of 34 years of life in which not a single day had belonged to the man living it, and somehow, impossibly, it made every person in that room feel it. Mrs. Henderson, wife of a plantation owner from across the river, began to sob. She did not know why. She had owned slaves her entire life. She had never thought twice about it. But the music reached inside her and touched something that had been sleeping, and when it woke, it wept. Judge Morrison, no relation to Ezekiel's former master, felt his hands begin to tremble. He had sentenced runaway slaves to death. He had ruled in favor of owners in every dispute. But the music made him remember the face of a woman he had sent to the auction block 30 years ago, separated from her child, and for the first time in 3 decades he wondered what had become of her. Colonel Ashworth sat frozen in his chair. His face had lost all color. The glass in his hand tilted, spilling wine onto his trousers, but he did not notice. He was remembering his father, the original Ashworth, building this plantation on land cleared by people whose descendants still worked these fields. He was remembering the stories his father told, the methods his father used, the casual brutality that had been passed down like an inheritance. The music built, layer upon layer, sound upon sound, a symphony of sorrow and defiance that seemed to fill the entire house, to spill out through the windows and across the land, to echo in places where such sounds had never been permitted. And then, at the peak of its intensity, the music shifted. What emerged was something else entirely. Not sorrow now, not grief. Something like hope, but sharper. Something like joy, but stronger. A melody that spoke of a world that did not yet exist but might. A world where the children of slaves stood as equals with the children of masters, where chains existed only in museums, where the music that had been forbidden played openly in concert halls that welcomed everyone. The melody soared. It climbed higher and higher, reaching for something beyond the ceiling, beyond the sky, beyond everything that bound human beings to their worst instincts. It promised nothing and everything. It demanded nothing and everything, And then, with one final note that seemed to hang in the air for an eternity, it stopped. Silence. The room held 40 guests, all of them wealthy, all of them powerful, all of them complicit in a system that had made this moment necessary. Not one of them moved. Not one of them spoke. Marianne Beaumont was the first to react. She rose from her seat, her face streaming with tears, and brought her hands together in applause. The sound broke something, whether it was a spell or a dam or simply the shell of convention that protected these people from their own humanity. Something cracked and fell away. One by one, the guests stood. One by one, they began to applaud. Not polite applause, not the measured recognition of entertainment well performed. This was something else, raw, cathartic, almost desperate. Whitmore alone remained still. His face had gone through several changes during the performance, contempt to confusion, to something that might have been recognition. Now it was blank. His eyes fixed on Ezekiel with an intensity that promised nothing good. But in this moment, that did not matter. Because Silas Whitmore, the cruelest overseer in 3 counties, the man who had killed Thomas, the man who had broken more bodies and spirits than he could count, was doing something no one had ever seen him do. His head was bowed, not in prayer, not in respect, but in something he could not name, something the music had forced upon him against his will. For the first time in his life, Silas Whitmore felt the weight of what he had done, and it drove his head down toward the floor. The moment lasted perhaps 3 seconds. Then his head snapped back up, and the mask of cruelty fell back into place. But everyone had seen. Everyone knew. Something had shifted in that room that could never shift back. Ezekiel lowered his violin. His face remained calm, almost peaceful. He had done what he came to do. Whatever happened next, they had felt it. Just once, they had felt what they had done. He stepped down from the platform and walked toward the door, his bare feet silent on the polished floor. Marianne Beaumont called after him. "Wait, please wait." He paused. "That was the most beautiful music I have ever heard in my life." Her voice trembled. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Ezekiel turned. For a moment he let the mask slip. He let her see him, not the slave, not the performer, but the man. "I learned from my grandmother," he said. "She learned from hers. The music did not begin with your world, ma'am. It only passed through." Then he was gone, out through the servants' entrance, back toward the quarters where his people were waiting to hear what had happened. Behind him, the party attempted to resume. Wine was poured. Conversation started and stopped, but the evening had lost its momentum, its purpose. One by one, the guests began to make their excuses. One by one, the carriages rolled away. By midnight, only the family remained, the colonel, his wife, and Marianne Beaumont. They sat in the parlor where the performance had taken place, surrounded by glasses and plates and the detritus of celebration, none of them speaking. Finally, Marianne broke the silence. "You cannot keep him in the fields." The colonel stared at her. "I beg your pardon?" "That man, Ezekiel, whatever you call him, he is a genius, an actual genius. Do you have any idea how rare that is? Do you have any idea what he could become? He is my property. Property does not play like that. Property does not create beauty like that. What I witnessed tonight was—" She stopped, searching for words. "It was sacred. I do not use that word lightly. And what would you have me do? Free him?" The question hung in the air. It was rhetorical. They both knew it. Freedom for a slave in Mississippi was not simply a matter of signing papers. There were laws, restrictions, requirements that made manumission nearly impossible. Even if the colonel wanted to free Ezekiel, which he emphatically did not, the path forward would be treacherous. But Marianne Beaumont had money. Marianne Beaumont had connections. And Marianne Beaumont had just heard something that changed the way she understood the world. "I am going to buy him from you," she said. "Name your price." "He's not for sale." "Everything is for sale, Jeremiah. That's the foundation of your entire economy, isn't it? Human beings treated as commodities. Well, I am playing by your rules. I want to purchase this commodity. The colonel's face twisted. Even if I were willing, Whitmore would never. Whitmore works for you. Remind him of that. The argument continued for hours. It would continue for days. But something had been set in motion that night that would not easily stop. In the quarters, Ezekiel sat surrounded by his people. They had heard the reports from house servants who witnessed parts of the performance. They had seen the carriages leave early, the guests' faces marked with something none of them understood. "What did you do?" old Sarah asked. Ezekiel smiled. It was not a happy smile. It was something else. The smile of a man who has done what he set out to do and now awaits the consequences. "I made them feel it," he said, "just like I promised. And now?" He looked at his violin, at the crude instrument that had channeled something beyond its construction. "Now we wait." But waiting would not be necessary for long. The days following the harvest celebration brought changes that rippled through Ashwood like waves from a stone dropped in still water. Whitmore's behavior shifted in ways no one could have predicted. The overseer, so confident in his cruelty, seemed uncertain for the first time in anyone's memory. He still carried gospel. He still walked the rows during cotton picking. But something in his eyes had changed, something that looked almost like fear. He avoided Ezekiel entirely. When their paths crossed, Whitmore would find somewhere else to look, something else to attend to. The man who had killed Thomas without hesitation could not seem to meet the eyes of Thomas's teacher. The enslaved community noticed. They noticed everything. Word spread beyond Ashwood as well. The guests who had attended the harvest celebration carried the story home with them, and from there it spread further. To New Orleans, to Mobile, to Charleston, to every corner of the slaveholding South. The story changed with each telling, grew more elaborate, acquired details that may or may not have been true. But the core remained consistent. A slave had picked up a violin and made an entire room of white aristocrats weep. The story traveled north as well. Abolitionists in Philadelphia and Boston heard versions of it within weeks. Frederick Douglass mentioned it in a speech, though he did not know Ezekiel's name. The tale became one more piece of evidence in the case against slavery. Proof that the system destroyed not just bodies but squandered genius, buried treasures, denied humanity to people who held more grace in their broken hands than their masters held in their entire estates. For Ezekiel himself, the days following the performance were a strange, suspended time. Marianne Beaumont's negotiations with the colonel continued, conducted in the main house at all hours, their raised voices sometimes carrying to the quarters. The enslaved community watched and waited, unsure whether to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope had betrayed them too many times. But something was different now. Something had changed in the air itself, in the quality of the silence that had defined Ashwood for so long. People held their heads a little higher, their whispers carried a little further. The fear that Whitmore had cultivated so carefully seemed to have developed cracks. On the 7th day after the performance, the first crack became a fissure. A group of field workers, 7 men who had been at Ashwood for a decade or more, approached Whitmore as he made his morning rounds. They did not speak. They did not raise their hands. They simply stood in his path, blocking his way, their eyes meeting his. It should not have been possible. Everything in the structure of Ashwood was designed to prevent exactly this moment. But the music had opened something, had reminded these men of their own humanity, and now they were testing, carefully, cautiously, the limits of what that humanity might reclaim. Whitmore reached for gospel. His hand found the familiar handle, but something stopped him from uncoiling the whip. Maybe it was the numbers, 7 against 1. Maybe it was the look in their eyes, not rage, not desperation, just steady certainty. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the memory of music that still echoed in his ears, reminding him that these were not animals, not property, not units of labor, but human beings who had been patient for a very long time. "Get back to work," he said. His voice lacked its usual authority. The men held their position for 3 heartbeats. Then, slowly, deliberately, they stepped aside. They had not achieved anything concrete. No demands had been made or met. No victory had been won. But they had done something unprecedented at Ashwood. They had faced Whitmore without flinching, and they had walked away unharmed. Word of this small rebellion spread through the quarters by nightfall. By the next morning, similar incidents had occurred twice more. Groups of enslaved workers standing their ground for just a moment, reclaiming a sliver of dignity before returning to their labor. Whitmore responded as might be expected. He doubled his patrols. He selected 2 of the men from the first group for public whipping, an example meant to restore the order that was slipping away. He dragged them to the punishment post near the cotton gin and prepared to demonstrate that nothing had changed. But something had changed. As he raised gospel for the first strike, a sound drifted across the plantation. Someone was humming, not loudly, not aggressively, just a quiet melody that carried on the wind. The melody Ezekiel had played on the night of the celebration, the part that spoke of hope, of a world yet to come. Whitmore spun, trying to locate the source. The humming stopped. He turned back to his victims, raised the whip again. The humming resumed, from a different direction this time. He whipped his head around. Silence. He faced forward. The humming started once more, now from 3 different places at once. The gathered slaves watched with expressions of perfect blankness. No one's lips moved. No one could be identified as the source. But the melody continued, swelling and fading, impossible to pinpoint, impossible to stop. Whitmore's face contorted. Rage and something else fought for control of his features. The something else looked remarkably like terror. He brought the whip down. Once, twice, 5 times. But his arm had lost its certainty. The blows fell without their usual precision, without the mechanical expertise that had earned him his reputation. When he finished, the 2 men were bloodied but not broken. They walked away under their own power, their backs straight despite the wounds. That night in the quarters, the community gathered around Ezekiel. "They're scared," someone said. "I never thought I'd see it. They're actually scared." Ezekiel nodded slowly. "Fear is a door. Once it opens, it doesn't close so easily. What do we do now?" "We keep the door open. We keep reminding them that we're still here, that we've always been here, that we're not going away." Old Sarah, seated in the corner, spoke up. "The Beaumont woman. She's still trying to buy you?" "Seems so." "You gonna go? If she manages it?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment. When he answered, his voice carried a weight that made everyone lean closer to hear. "I don't know yet. Part of me says go. Get out while I can. Take whatever freedom she's offering. Part of me says stay. That what started here shouldn't be abandoned, that this community needs someone to keep playing the music." "That's a heavy choice." "It is." The days that followed brought escalation on both sides. Whitmore, his authority challenged in ways he could not have imagined, grew more brutal and more erratic. He called for reinforcements, 3 additional overseers borrowed from neighboring plantations, men with reputations for dealing with difficult slave populations. Together, they began a campaign of terror designed to stamp out the nascent rebellion before it could grow. The whippings increased, the food rations decreased. Work hours extended until laborers were collapsing in the fields from exhaustion. 2 people died, an older woman whose heart gave out during a punishment detail, and a young man who simply lay down one evening and never got up again. But the humming continued. The small acts of defiance multiplied. The door that Ezekiel's music had opened refused to close. Then came the night that changed everything. It was October now, the cotton nearly harvested, the weather cooling toward a winter that promised hardship. Ezekiel was asleep in his cabin when the door burst open, and rough hands dragged him into the night. Whitmore stood outside, flanked by his borrowed overseers, his face illuminated by torchlight. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" he snarled. "You think I don't see it? Every time they hum that damn song, every time they stand a little taller, it's because of you. Because of what you played that night." Ezekiel said nothing. There was nothing to say. "I wanted to sell you south, break you in the sugar fields, let the work camps in Louisiana grind whatever's special about you into dust." Whitmore's voice dripped with venom. "But the colonel won't allow it. His sister-in-law has him wrapped around her finger. She wants you preserved like some kind of museum piece. He stepped closer, his breath hot against Ezekiel's face. So I can't sell you. I can't kill you. But I can make sure you never play that violin again. He nodded to the men beside him. They held Ezekiel down while Whitmore produced a hammer, the same kind of hammer used to drive cotton press pins, heavy iron with a worn wooden handle. He positioned Ezekiel's right hand against a wooden block. Every time you struck a note that night, Whitmore said, you were stealing something that didn't belong to you. Hope, beauty, the pretension that you're anything more than what I say you are. He raised the hammer. Let's see how much music you make with broken fingers. The hammer fell. Ezekiel's scream split the night. The hammer fell again, and again. When it was over, his right hand was a ruin, fingers twisted at angles nature never intended, bones shattered beyond any healer's ability to repair. The hand that had produced sounds to make angels weep would never move properly again. Whitmore and his men left Ezekiel in the dirt, unconscious from pain and blood loss. They laughed as they walked away, convinced they had won, convinced the rebellion had been crushed along with those fingers. They were wrong. By dawn, the entire enslaved community knew what had happened. They gathered outside Ezekiel's cabin, silent witnesses to his suffering. Old Sarah, with her kitchen skills, cleaned and bandaged the destroyed hand as best she could. Others brought water, food, blankets. When Ezekiel finally regained consciousness, the first face he saw was that of a young woman named Grace, Thomas's mother. They took your hand, she said. Her voice was steady, but her eyes burned with something that had been building for years. They took Thomas. They take and take and take. Ezekiel looked at his ruined hand, at the fingers that would never again dance across strings. The pain was extraordinary, but beneath it something else stirred. Not despair, as Whitmore had intended, but a cold clarity that cut through the agony like light through darkness. Then we stop letting them take, he said. We take back. What followed was unlike anything that had ever happened on a southern plantation. Ezekiel could no longer play, but he could plan. He could organize. And most importantly, he could inspire, because the brutality inflicted upon him had finally snapped something that had been straining for generations. The rebellion that formed was not like Nat Turner's violent uprising, or the desperate flights along the Underground Railroad. It was something new, something born from music, a coordinated campaign of resistance that struck at the foundations of the plantation system itself. It began with work stoppages, not obvious ones. The cotton still got picked, the tasks still got done. But somehow, inexplicably, productivity dropped. 15%, then 20%, then 30%. No amount of whipping could restore it, because the slowdown was invisible, distributed across hundreds of small decisions and careful miscalculations. Then came the whisper campaign. Information flowed from Ashwood to neighboring plantations, carried by those who passed between properties on errands and loans. The story of the music, the story of the hammer, the story of a community that had chosen to stop cooperating with its own destruction. Similar slowdowns began appearing across Natchez District. Overseers reported strange happenings, tools breaking with unusual frequency, animals falling ill, structures weakening overnight. Nothing that could be traced to specific individuals. Nothing that could be punished with certainty. Just a persistent sense that the machine was breaking down. Marianne Beaumont, still negotiating for Ezekiel's purchase, found herself drawn into something larger than she had anticipated. The news of his maiming had reached her the morning after it happened, delivered by a house servant whose careful neutrality barely masked her horror. Marianne had wept. Then she had done something far more dangerous. She had written letters. Her correspondence reached abolitionist networks in the North, British sympathizers whose anti-slavery activism was reshaping international opinion, journalists who specialized in exposing the horrors of the peculiar institution. Within weeks, the story of Ashwood was no longer a local matter. It had become ammunition in a larger war. Colonel Ashworth found himself receiving uncomfortable letters from associates who had heard disturbing things. His credit became harder to secure. Potential buyers for his cotton began expressing reluctance. And through it all, From his pallet in the quarters, Ezekiel orchestrated the music of collapse. He could no longer play strings, but he could compose a different kind of symphony. He taught others the melodies he had created, not just the sounds, but the meanings, the secret language that allowed information to flow even under the watchful eyes of overseers. A certain tune hummed while working meant a meeting tonight. A particular rhythm tapped against a cabin wall meant danger approaching. The music became a communication network that the masters could hear but never understand. Whitmore knew something was happening. He could feel control slipping through his fingers like water, could sense the authority he had built over years dissolving day by day. But he could not identify the source, could not find the thread that would unravel the entire tapestry. The man he had maimed still lay in his cabin, seemingly broken. The man whose music had started it all appeared to be exactly what Whitmore had made him, a ruined instrument, silenced forever. He could not have been more wrong. On the night of November 12, 1847, everything changed. A massive fire broke out in the cotton gin, the heart of Ashwood's economic machinery. No one was ever able to determine exactly how it started. The official record blamed an unattended lantern, an accident of carelessness. But everyone who was there that night knew better. The fire spread with remarkable speed, consuming the gin, the attached warehouses, and nearly a year's worth of stored cotton before anyone could respond. The glow lit up the Mississippi sky, visible for 20 miles in every direction. Colonel Ashworth lost everything. Not his life. He and his family escaped the main house when sparks began falling on its roof. But his fortune, his position, his place in the social hierarchy that had defined his existence. The cotton that should have funded his lifestyle for another year was ash. The equipment that should have processed next year's harvest was twisted metal. Whitmore disappeared that same night. Some said he fled north, changing his name, starting over far from the scene of his failures. Others claimed to have seen him heading west, toward territories where no one knew his face or his reputation. A few whispered that he never left at all, that his body lay somewhere in the ruins of the gin, another victim of the fire he had made inevitable through years of brutality. Whatever the truth, Silas Whitmore was never seen in Natchez again. The dispersal that followed was chaotic. Colonel Ashworth, facing financial ruin, was forced to sell his human property to satisfy creditors. The enslaved community of Ashwood, the community that had been forged in suffering and resistance, was scattered across the South, individual lives sold to new masters in new places. But they carried something with them. They carried the melodies. They carried the memory. They carried the knowledge that resistance was possible, that music could be a weapon, that even the most powerful system contained the seeds of its own destruction. Ezekiel was among the last to be sold. Marianne Beaumont, her negotiations rendered moot by the colonel's collapse, managed to track his sale and purchase him at auction in New Orleans. She brought him to her own property outside the city, not as a slave, though the legal fiction had to be maintained, but as something closer to a ward. His hand never healed. The fingers remained twisted, the nerves deadened, the musical genius locked forever in a body that could no longer express it. But Marianne hired physicians, musicians, anyone who might help him find new ways to share what he carried inside. In time, he learned to teach. Not by demonstration. His hands could no longer form the shapes required, but by voice, by instruction, by passing on the knowledge that had been given to him and that he had expanded through genius and suffering. Students came to study with him, some white, some free black, some escaping from bondage through routes he knew better than to discuss openly. The music spread. By 1860, variations of the melodies Ezekiel had created at Ashwood had traveled across the continent. They appeared in spirituals sung by the enslaved, in folk songs performed by traveling musicians, in hymns that took root in churches both black and white. The specific origins became obscured, the names forgotten, but the essence remained. Music that spoke of suffering and hope, of bondage and freedom, of a world that was and a world that could be. When the Civil War came, both sides drew on musical traditions that could trace their lineage, in part, back to that crude violin at Ashwood. The Union troops marched to songs whose rhythms echoed the secret communications of the enslaved. The freedom that finally arrived carried melodies that had been composed in captivity, dreaming of this very moment. Ezekiel lived to see it. He was 52 when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, still living in Louisiana, still teaching anyone who would learn. The hand that Whitmore had destroyed was hidden beneath gloves he wore constantly, but his voice remained strong, and his memory remained perfect, and his determination to pass on what he knew never wavered. He died in 1871, at the age of 58, of a fever that swept through the region after a particularly brutal summer. His former students gathered for his funeral, a remarkable assemblage of people who had learned from him across the years, now scattered across the reunited nation. They played for him one last time, 100 instruments, maybe more, performing the melody he had created that September night at Ashwood when he had made a room full of slaveholders weep. The music rose from the cemetery outside New Orleans and drifted across the landscape, carried by wind that seemed to remember everything. Old Sarah had died years before, but some of her descendants were present. Grace, Thomas's mother, had somehow survived the diaspora and was there, ancient now, her face marked by decades of continued struggle, but her eyes still carrying the fire that Ezekiel's music had helped ignite. When the last note faded, Grace stepped forward and spoke. "This man's hands were destroyed by hatred," she said, "but his gift could not be destroyed. His music lives in all of us, in everyone who ever heard it, in everyone who will hear it through the generations to come. They tried to silence him, and they failed. They will always fail." She paused, gathering herself, and then added something that would be remembered and repeated until it became legend. He picked up a violin, and even the devil bowed his head. The echoes have not stopped. In Mississippi, in Louisiana, in every place where those scattered seeds fell, the legacy continued. The music transformed, evolved, merged with other traditions, became blues, became jazz, became rock and roll, became rap, became every form of American musical expression that speaks of struggle and transcendence. Scholars have argued for decades about Ezekiel's place in this evolution. Some say the connections are tenuous, that too much time has passed to trace direct lineage. Others point to specific melodic patterns, rhythmic structures, emotional resonances that seem too consistent to be coincidence. But those who know don't need academic validation. In the black churches of the Deep South, in the jazz clubs of New Orleans, in the music studios of Memphis and Detroit and everywhere the American sound has traveled, there are people who understand. They feel it in their bones, the connection to something older, to a man who took impossibility and shaped it into art, who faced destruction and answered with creation. The ruins at Ashwood still stand. Those 3 brick columns, slowly being consumed by the land, still mark the place where it happened. Tourists sometimes drive down Old River Road looking for antebellum plantation tours, grand homes preserved to showcase the elegance of a bygone era. They rarely find their way to Ashwood. The path is unmarked, the history is inconvenient, but on certain nights people say the music still plays, not loudly, not distinctly, just a whisper on the wind, a melody that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere, a sound that makes listeners stop and wonder what they're feeling. Some dismiss it as imagination. Some explain it as natural phenomena. Wind through the columns, animals in the brush, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary place. But others know better. Others recognize it for what it is, the echo of a man who refused to be silenced, whose gift was stronger than hatred, whose music opened a door that has never fully closed. In Mississippi today, descendants of the enslaved community at Ashwood gather every September 18th at the ruins. They bring instruments of every kind, violins, guitars, drums, voices. They play and sing until dawn, honoring the memory of Ezekiel and all those who suffered and resisted alongside him. The gathering is not publicized. No advertisements appear in newspapers. No permits are filed with local authorities. Yet somehow, year after year, people find their way there, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds, drawn by something they cannot name but cannot ignore. They call it the violin night. The music that rises from those gatherings travels far. It has been recorded, studied, incorporated into compositions that have won awards and appeared on stages around the world. But those who attend say the recordings miss something essential, some quality that can only be experienced in person, standing on soil that remembers. Perhaps it is the presence of history, concentrated in that place like sediment at the bottom of a still pond. Perhaps it is the accumulated weight of all the celebrations before, each year adding another layer to the tradition. Or perhaps, and this is what the believers say, it is Ezekiel himself, still present in some form, still teaching, still refusing to let the music die. Whatever the truth, the effect is undeniable. People arrive carrying burdens and leave with them lifted. People arrive carrying anger and leave with it transformed. People arrive searching for something they cannot define and leave having found it, or at least having found the hope that it exists. The story of the overseer who bowed his head has passed into legend now, repeated in countless variations, embellished and elaborated, and sometimes distorted beyond recognition. But the core remains true. A man who had nothing picked up an instrument that should have been impossible, created beauty that should not have existed, and in doing so cracked open the armor of an entire system. The crack spread, other hands widened it. Eventually, the armor shattered entirely. What replaced it was imperfect, is imperfect still. The struggle that Ezekiel's music helped ignite continues, generation after generation, each one facing new forms of old oppressions, each one finding new ways to resist. The promised land his melodies reached toward remains unachieved, always on the horizon, always calling. But the music plays on. In hospitals and hospices, caregivers have noted that certain patients, particularly older Black patients, particularly those from the Deep South, sometimes begin humming a melody in their final hours. A melody no one taught them, no one requested, no one can identify. A melody that seems to bring peace to faces marked by lifetimes of hardship. Researchers have tried to trace this phenomenon, to document and explain it. Their papers contain theories about cultural transmission, about inherited memory, about the neurological effects of musical patterns on dying brains. But the families of those patients have a simpler explanation. Ezekiel's song, they say. He's welcoming them home. If you watched until here, it is because you care about these stories that marked our country forever. Leave a comment saying, I watched until here, so that I can meet you and know who really cares about the search for historical truth. Like this video if the story of Ezekiel touched your heart. Share so that the memory of Ezekiel will never be forgotten.